Hey guys, I hope that everything is working here and just making sure everything's set up correctly. But we'll go ahead and welcome you to our Biblical Archaeology 101. And we are excited to have you join us with us tonight. And those of you who are joining with us, thank you for being here. And yes, I have the Flowerty shirt on. A little bit of explanation for the shirt. Here in Chicago, it is last night, the high was the low was 7 degrees. So it's been snowing and complete winter mix here for the last several days. So this is my act of rebellion against the cold weather here in the upper Midwest. So I am thinking warm thoughts. That's why I'm wearing the Flowerty shirt. I'm hoping and wishing that I was on some warm excavation somewhere in the sun, sitting in the sand. So anyway, this is my take on cold weather here as a Southerner here in Babylonian exile in the upper Midwest. So anyway, thank you guys for joining with us today. We are going to have an exciting time. I hope it's exciting for you. I'm really pumped about tonight's lesson / presentation on what is biblical archaeology. It seems like everybody that you look at on the internet is some kind of expert on biblical archaeology, and people have a lot of thoughts about it. Apologists talk about it. There's a lot of blogs about it now. So I thought it might be a good idea for us to sort of go over what is the basic principles of biblical archaeology, and what really is it? I mean, when we talk about, a lot of people talk about biblical archaeology, but what exactly is biblical archaeology? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And so give me a second here. I'm going to do a share screen, but I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to get logged on. But I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I hope and pray that you guys are doing well and that everybody is healthy. I'm praying for, I know several folks that I have family, not family members, but I have friends who have relatives that are dealing with the coronavirus. So I hope and pray that you and your family are doing well. But anyway, tonight we're going to talk about archaeology and history. So anyway, so go ahead and share screen. And so stand by for that. And then we will go ahead and get started tonight. So anyway, this is a presentation that we're going to call Biblical Archaeology 101. Obviously, this is a massive subject, and there's a lot that we can talk about, and there's a lot we can say about what biblical archaeology is. So I obviously don't have the last word on the subject, but I have studied this for over 20 years, and I've been in the field as an archaeologist excavating. I'm currently working on a project now, hoping to be going overseas here very soon to work on a project. But I wanted to share with you all and our followers and our listeners for Epic Archaeology, or from Epic Archaeology, some thoughts about what the discipline actually is of biblical archaeology. So what I like to do is just to start out by kind of giving an overview of tonight and what we're going to go through, hopefully what I would like to cover tonight in tonight's presentation, sort of just a guideline as to what I would like to cover. First is the origins of the science of archaeology, and to really answer the question, what is archaeology? So we'll talk about the origins of archaeology. Where did it begin? What exactly is it? How is it different than history? We'll talk about that. We'll discuss that. Then the origins of biblical archaeology. So we want to look at how biblical archaeology figures into archaeology in general, and where does it fit into world archaeology? So where did archaeology begin? And then kind of give a brief history of biblical archaeology, because I think it's important that we understand where biblical archaeology came from, where its roots are. And because I'm a firm believer in that the best way to study a subject is to study the history of that subject, whether that subject is science or history or archaeology. Because what we can see in studying the history of a subject is we can see where it has come from and where it is now and where it might perhaps go in the future. So we're going to look at the history of biblical archaeology. And then we're going to outline some basic principles of biblical archaeology. These are my own thoughts about it. I'm sure that there are colleagues that I have that may have different principles, but I do think that biblical archaeology is a legitimate academic discipline on par with any other academic discipline that historians or scholars might want to study. So I think that biblical archaeology is an important discipline in biblical studies. And we'll kind of break that down here in just a few moments, and I'll explain more about what I mean by that. Then we're going to talk about some significant discoveries in biblical archaeology. And what I think you're going to find is that many of the discoveries that archaeologists have found were discovered by people who were not necessarily calling themselves biblical archaeologists. These are just archaeologists who happen to find things that, oh, lo and behold, this is evidence for the biblical text. So we're going to talk about some significant discoveries. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for your questions, in which I would like for you to type your questions in on the comment section. I'm going to try to follow along as best I can. Right now, this is a one-man show, so I'll do the best that I can in answering your questions. No question is off limits, including questions about aliens and whether or not the aliens built the pyramids. You can certainly ask a question like that. So this is sort of our flow for tonight. This is what I would like to cover. Again, it's a massive subject. There's a lot that can be said about biblical archaeology, but so I think this is a kind of a good guideline for us as we begin to unpack what biblical archaeology is. But first, we're going to start out with the origins of archaeology, and I want to start out with a quote from a very, very influential person that you may or may not have heard of, Paris Hilton. Yes, Paris Hilton, the one and only, the lovely Paris Hilton. She says, "I need to go to a freaking archaeologist." What are those people called? The ones who crack your back. You know, Paris Hilton, you know, the great scholar, Paris Hilton. I have no idea an archaeologist is someone who cracks your back. Well, I actually happened to find, and Miss Hilton, that is actually a chiropractor. But I did happen to find the rare chiropractic archaeologist at work right here in the field, doing work on the backbone of a dead person there down in the tell, or the archaeological square. So all kidding aside, an archaeologist is not a chiropractor. What is archaeology? Well, let's just start out with a basic definition of what archaeology is. Archaeology is an investigation of the past through the scientific analysis of artifacts left behind by past human cultures. That's basically what it is. It is a study of things that humans have left behind. And there's all kinds of things that people have left behind. The best example that I can give of trying to understand really what archaeology is goes back to my undergraduate days in archaeology. One of the very first classes that I had in archaeology, and I remember my professor well. Her name is Dr. Janet Rafferty, and she's now deceased. But Professor Rafferty had us all do something called our Garbology Project. Yes, I said that right. Garbology Project. What I'm talking about is garbage. And we had to get permission from a neighbor or a friend to collect a bag of trash. Yep, a bag of their trash, and to have basically a chart in which we were to actually keep track of what we discovered in their trash. And it's interesting because you can actually discover and find out a lot about a person and who they are by what they throw away. You can find out what kind of soft drinks they like. You can find out what kind of food they eat. You can find out what kind of cosmetics they use. You can find out what shampoo, whatever, you know. You could probably find out things you didn't want to know about your neighbor through digging through their trash. But really, that's really what it is. I mean, archaeology is essentially, we're just studying the trash that people have left behind in the past human cultures. So that's what it is. Here's another way to put it, and this is kind of the same thing that I said just in the previous slide. Again, it's the scientific investigation of the material remains of past human cultures, which includes the recovery, the cataloging, and the analyzing and the interpretation of the artifact. So it's not just that we're looking through trash. We are doing it scientifically. That's what archaeologists do. We are looking through the trash. We are scientific trash people. That's really what we are. And that's true. It really is true. You can ask any archaeologist and they'll tell you the same thing. It's really, we're doing this in a scientific rational way. So that's really what it is. You have to actually get it out of the ground, and to actually recover the artifacts, we're using scientific methods. We're using stratigraphy. We're using all kinds of really high-tech remote sensing, ground penetrating radar, you name it, drones, any number of scientific ways where we can actually get the stuff out of the ground. Then we actually record it, we catalog it, we analyze it, we break it apart, we put it back together, all those kinds of things. So it is an auxiliary science of history. History, on the other hand, is a study of the past by using written records. So there is a distinction between archaeology on one hand and history on the other hand. Archaeology studies the past by artifacts, whereas historians study the past by using and by looking at written text. Now, there are occasions in which an archaeological discovery can be made on an artifact where there's writing on the artifact. Well, then what do you do then? Is it a historian look at it, or do the archaeologists? Well, we both have an interest. Both the archaeologist and the historian have an interest in historical inscriptions. And there have been some very famous historical inscriptions that have been discovered that have helped us to really understand the past in a much better way. And what we're going to talk about a couple of those tonight. One of them you probably already know off the top of your head, the Rosetta Stone, which was the artifact that helps us to understand ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So hopefully you're clear about that. Archaeology is to study the past by looking and studying artifacts. So let's talk about where did archaeology come from, and where did people begin to really study how to excavate and how to actually study the past in a systematic, scientific way. We go all the way back to this city that most of you have heard of, I'm sure. I don't know if anybody's probably never heard of the Roman city of Pompeii, and the sister city is called Herculaneum, whereas the Italians call it Herculanum. But the city was basically a Roman city that was destroyed in 79 AD, located in southern Italy, there on the Bay of Naples. And Mount Vesuvius, which is a volcano, erupted in 79 AD and buried the entire city. I actually got to go there several years ago. It's quite remarkable. I would encourage anyone who's interested in archaeology to visit Pompeii and Herculaneum. If you are able to do that, I would encourage you to do that. It's really, truly amazing and awesome. So let's talk about Herculaneum and Pompeii and its relationship to archaeology and how archaeology really got started. The city first appears on a map of Roman roads, and I'm probably going to slaughter this pronunciation, but it's the Tabula Petungeriana, which is basically a map in the 4th century that mentions the name of the city. Now, again, it's just a map that mentions, we haven't found the map, but it does mention Pompeii. But by that time in the 4th century, the city is completely buried under the ash. There was actually later in the 5th century, there was another volcanic eruption that actually buried the city deeper into ash. So it had been buried since for at least 2,000 years, the city was buried. Then in 1592, there was an architect by the name of Domenico Fontana who discovered walls covered in frescoes, which are paintings on the wall, painted in the plaster while it was wet. He was constructing an underground aqueduct, and he discovered these walls around the city of Pompeii, or at least where the ruins are. Herculaneum, which was Pompeii's sister city, was rediscovered in 1738 by workmen building a foundation for a summer palace of the King of Naples, a man by the name of Charles of Bourbon. And so he discovered these walls. And then in the same century, in 1749, a Swiss architect and engineer, a guy by the name of Carl Jacob Weber, conducted the first scientific excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum and a city called Stabia. So this was the first record that we have, at least from a European standpoint, of an actual scientific excavation of a site in Europe. Now, let me say this as I'm going to jump back here and talk about the climate in the 19th century, because in order to understand biblical archaeology, we need to understand the cultural milieu or the cultural context in which biblical archaeology arose, because biblical archaeology has only been around for over 100 years or so. It's not really been around for a long time. I mean, as a science, it's fairly a new science. So so in the context of where biblical archaeology arose, in the 1870s, there was a book published by a German scholar by the name of Julius Wellhausen called the Prolegomena to the History of Israel. And now it didn't originate with Wellhausen, but this was sort of a culmination of theories that were floating around since at least the 17th, 16th centuries, going all the way back to the philosopher Spinoza and David Hume and others, who looked at the biblical record as just made up. They basically took out the miracles and essentially culminated into something called the documentary hypothesis. And so here's sort of a overview of what that is, because I'll show you how this figures into biblical archaeology. Basically, in the documentary hypothesis, which is where many people today even sort of follow along with the same principles here, is that they deny Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, obviously the first 5 books of the Bible, but they basically say Moses did not write this, that most of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, were very likely written during the Babylonian exile, which they do hold that there was a Babylonian exile, but they believe that most of the Old Testament, at least the first parts of it, were composed during the Babylonian exile. So it denies Mosaic authorship, and it undermines the basic historicity of the Pentateuch. So events like the Exodus and conquest were likely fabricated during this time because they were trying to give themselves, the Jews, the ancient Hebrews were trying to give themselves some sort of historical story, myth, I guess, if you will, to their history. And so it was made up. So the text, according to the documentary hypothesis, the biblical text is likely ahistorical or non-historical. So most of it you really can't trust. So this is the climate in which biblical archaeology arose. There was another book that was published, very famous book that I'll give you the date. I'll throw it out there. See if you can guess what it is. In 1859, a very famous British naturalist published a book that really rocked the world. And of course, some of you may have guessed it. Yes, it was Charles Darwin, and his book was On the Origin of Species. So, which also, to many people, undermined, and that's another debate, another little side debate for another time, but many people at the time, many academics and scholars believed that that Darwin discovered how humans got here, that we evolved from previous ape-like ancestors, and that basically the Genesis account of creation was actually wrong. So again, this is sort of the climate in which biblical archaeology sort of rose up in the world. This to show you how this carries over to today. This was a book written back several years ago. It's a modern book, but written back in the last century, back in the 1990s. This is a quote by a Jewish scholar by the name of Baruch Halpern. He's talking about the Exodus. He says he's comparing the Exodus essentially with the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He says in both cases, there is evidence of that peculiar process of oral transmission in which the story is renegotiated with each separate audience each time it's told. Each story reflects a healthy admixture of fancy with whatever is being recalled. The Odyssey is basically a piece of children's literature. So in its way is the story of the Exodus. It is the historical myth of an entire people, a focal point of national identity. The actual evidence concerning the Exodus resembles the evidence for a unicorn. And I could give you quote after quote. Another book I have right behind me on the shelf is written by an Israeli scholar by the name of Amon Ben-Tor. And Dr. Ben-Tor, Professor Ben-Tor, is a brilliant archaeologist, a great guy, has written some great stuff. But again, he also has a very, very skeptical view of the biblical text, which is quite ironic to me. So let's talk about some important discoveries that were foundational to biblical archaeology, because we're working towards understanding what biblical archaeology is and really where it comes into the scene historically and where it comes into the scene when it comes to biblical studies. So here are a few important discoveries that were foundational to biblical archaeology. One is historical geography. Two figures that really are important in laying the foundations for modern biblical archaeology are a guy by the name of Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, who was a missionary in Lebanon. And Edward Robinson and Eli Smith in the 1830s traveled throughout Palestine and rediscovered many of the place names of biblical sites that had been lost for 2,000 years. Because remember, up to that time, up to the invention or up to the rise of biblical archaeology, the belief that certain things happened was just purely by faith. I mean, people in Europe and America, people who believe the Bible, Christians, believed and trusted in the text by faith. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fantastic. I mean, without faith, it's impossible to please God. But remember, archaeology had not come around then. So in the 1830s, Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, they traveled throughout Palestine, and they then began to rediscover place names based in the Arabic and some other text, some of the place names of actual historical sites that are mentioned in the Bible. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about them in just a second. Another very important discovery was found in 1799 by the French. And this was the rediscovery of Egypt, or the discovery of ancient Egypt. Now, Egypt had been known about for centuries. I mean, going back even to the time of ancient Rome. I mean, Egypt is a very ancient civilization, and even the Romans were fascinated by ancient Egypt. But as far as the scientific study of Egypt, it wasn't until 1799 until the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and it was translated in around 1821, 1823, if my dates are correct on that. We'll talk more about that here in a second. We're just kind of reviewing right now. Then in 1909, the Hittites were discovered. The ancient Hittite civilization was discovered by a German archaeologist working in Turkey. His name was Hugo Winkler. Now, again, Hugo Winkler is not a biblical archaeologist. He is a German archaeologist working in Turkey. And he finds this civilization, and it was Christians who made mention of the fact that what he discovered actually might be the Hittites that are mentioned in the Bible. So right from the outset, we have discoveries that were made in the 19th century that begin to affirm what the biblical record was actually saying. So again, Hugo Winkler, to my knowledge, I don't know what his faith commitments were, but he was a German archaeologist, and he discovered the Hittites. Not only did he discover the Hittites at a site called Hattusha, which is one of the largest archaeological sites in Turkey, even to this day. He discovered their language, the Hittite language. In fact, here in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, at the Oriental Institute, they actually have a Hittite dictionary, and they are still translating some of these Hittite texts that have not been fully translated. So that began back in the early 1900s. Then going back again to the 19th century, we have the discovery of Mesopotamia. We're talking about Iran and Iraq. And in Iran, we discovered, not we, but I'm talking about, but German and French scholars discovered many of the places that are mentioned in the Old Testament, and many of the artifacts that actually affirm what the Old Testament says. I'm thinking of the discovery of Persepolis, which was one of the capitals of ancient Persia, and then also the discovery of Nineveh, and also many sites in Iraq. And in the 19th century was a German archaeologist by the name of Robert Koldewey, and then Hormuzd Rassam and others. In fact, I believe it was Hormuzd Rassam who actually discovered the cuneiform tablets that actually contain the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll talk about in a second as well. So in the 19th century, and then back in the 1700s, you've got all these discoveries that are being made of these ancient civilizations that had been long lost to history, and now they're beginning to come to light. Here's a good analogy. I thought about this. It's been a year or so ago when I was giving a tour here in Chicago at the OI Museum. I thought this is a really great analogy. Some of you guys will get this analogy, some of you won't. So I realize this might be missed on some people. But excuse me. Do you guys remember the pardon me. Do you remember the old Polaroid cameras that you got where you'd like take the picture and the picture came out like instantly and it was like white and you had to like, I don't know why, but you always like would wave in the air and the picture would slowly develop on the actual film. You could actually see it develop. That is a great analogy to archaeology and to biblical archaeology. It is a slowly developing picture. And so the development of the ancient world began back in the 1800s, and it is now slowly being developed more and more. And as we move forward into time, as time moves forward, even to today, to 2021, the picture is becoming more and more developed. Now, that's not to say that archaeology is going to discover every single thing that ever happened in the Bible, because archaeology can't do that. It's very limited because of multiple factors, because of time, because of political reasons, geographical reasons, logistical reasons, personnel issues, all kinds of things. But it has now given us a very good picture of the ancient world. So hopefully that analogy will make sense. Another thing that figures into that's foundational for biblical archaeology is the rise of Bible societies in Europe and America. One in particular that I'm thinking of is something called the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, SPCK, I think it is, which basically intellectual Christians who thought about their faith, began to see the science of archaeology as an ally to their understanding of the text. Because remember, before archaeology, the only thing that they could do is read Greek and read Hebrew, and it was great. And they did a lot of expository hermeneutical things. But now with this new science of archaeology coming on the scene, we see things begin to develop. And there was one scholar in particular very early on who was a Roman historian by the name of Sir William Ramsay. And Ramsay actually studied ancient Rome, but then he began to see that the New Testament, in particular, the book of Acts and the book of Luke, were very, very historically accurate, and was a brilliant guy. In fact, if you just Google his name, Sir William Ramsay. He's got a lot of books on ancient Rome and the New Testament, and how the New Testament is a historically reliable document. And William Ramsay was writing back in the 19th century. So right here out of the gate, the archaeology was really beginning to affirm the biblical text. So Bible societies are important. And then the other thing is the rise of professional academic archaeology. ASOR stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research. Right here in Chicago, we have the Oriental Institute that was started by a scholar, the first American Egyptologist, a guy by the name of James Henry Breasted, who founded the OI here in Chicago. And then we have the Albright Institute that was founded by William F. Albright, or rather his followers. And there are other institutes as well. Certain universities like Harvard University, University of Pennsylvania, began to fund expeditions and actually have graduate programs in archaeology. And many great scholars came from these schools. Many New Testament and Old Testament scholars, archaeologists, came from these schools. So this is all sort of the seedbed of biblical archaeology. So let's talk about a couple of these things. Let's talk about geography here for a minute. I love this quote here. Hopefully you can see it. But it's by Bargill Pixner. And I read somewhere where Pixner actually may have been quoting from St. Jerome, who was one of the early church fathers. But he says this, I love this quote: "The four gospels record the life of Jesus. 4 you will find in books, and 1 you will find in the land they call holy." So basically what they're saying is that the 5th gospel is the Holy Land itself. The land itself is indicative that the biblical record is an accurate, it's it itself, the land testifies to the truthfulness of what the gospel says. So geography is very important. Earlier I mentioned Edward Robinson, and he is known as the father of biblical historical geography. Who was this guy? Well, he was a professor at Andover Theological Seminary in Massachusetts, and in 1837, he explored the Holy Land with missionary Eli Smith. He identified the foundations and entry of Herod's temple in Jerusalem, known as Robinson's Arch. He also located dozens of towns and places mentioned in the Bible, places such as Beersheba, Bethel, Gibeon, and many, many others. I actually have a copy, a facsimile copy of his book that he wrote back when he finished his journeys, and it has just got some really, really cool stuff in it. He also helped locate Hezekiah's tunnel under Jerusalem. There was another guy that I don't have a slide for. His name was Sir Charles Warren, who is an English engineer who also did some researches and measurements around Jerusalem. And so this is a photograph you can see there on the top left. This is an artist reconstruction of what the Temple Mount may have looked like during the time of Christ. And this is what on the bottom right, what it looks like today. And on the little circle there, and I got a better picture, you can see it there. Right there, this is from a photograph that I took back several years ago when I was in Jerusalem. But this is an architectural arch, the beginning of an arch entering into the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And by the way, while we're at it on this picture, I want to just point something out to you. If you look there on the bottom of that wall, that big wall that you're looking at, and you look down to the bottom left, you see some big square, well, they don't look big from here, but they're massive. They're like several tons a piece. These are called ashlar masonry. And this is a particular kind of stone construction that is indicative of Herodian architecture in the first century in Rome. And these on the bottom of that wall were actually pushed off by the Roman Emperor Hadrian after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans in the Jewish revolt in 70 AD. And which confirms Jesus' words in Matthew 24. You remember the episode where Jesus is talking with his disciples as they're leaving Jerusalem, and his disciples they like tap Jesus on the shoulder and they say, "Hey, look back, look at this," and they're pointing to Herod's temple, and it's beautiful. It's covered in gold, and it's probably covered in white marble and gold accents, just absolutely shining in the sun. And Jesus said, I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left upon another, all will be cast down. What you're looking at in this photograph is archaeological direct evidence that Jesus' words were fulfilled exactly as he said there in Matthew 24. I don't have a slide for it, but I have another little bit of cool information about that. Several years ago, an Italian archaeologist working in Rome discovered some, they had been known about for a while, but he worked on these big marble slabs that actually contained, during the Roman period, contained bronze letters, and they had been repurposed. And so he did some work on this and discovered and deciphered the Latin inscription on the marble slabs. And what they basically said was that the Colosseum, and get this now, the Colosseum in Rome, the Roman Colosseum, the big Colosseum that you see whenever you see a picture of Rome, the down payment for the Colosseum was basically provided by the gold that the Romans got from the temple in Jerusalem. Isn't that remarkable? And they had to do it, get this now, and this is from Josephus, they had to go, the Romans, when they came into the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, they wanted to get the gold out. There was inside of the temple, there was gold. They had to make a fire, and the gold melted and went into the rocks, and they had to pry the stones apart to get the gold out of the temple. And so anyway, really, really cool stuff. There's so much. So Robinson also discovered Hezekiah's tunnel. This is the tunnel that King Hezekiah in the Old Testament built when an Assyrian king by the name, a Neo-Assyrian king by the name of Sennacherib in the 8th century BC. So we're talking about 700 BC, 701 BC, besieged Jerusalem. And he, in preparation for the siege, King Hezekiah built a tunnel diverting the water from the spring of Gihon into Jerusalem, so that if the Assyrians laid siege to the city would have ample water. And there was actually an inscription found in the tunnel in which the workers, when they're working together, were digging on one side, one team was digging on one side, and the other team was digging on the other side. And as they dug, they met in the middle. And this inscription that you see on the bottom right is actually Hebrew for when the excavators of the tunnel actually met. An interesting fact about this is that that inscription today is in the Istanbul Museum in Istanbul, because at that time, Palestine was under control of the Ottoman Empire. So it was taken off, chiseled off, and now it is in the Istanbul Museum there in Turkey. Pretty cool stuff. There's the inscription, and this is actually the biblical reference that actually affirms what this actually says. 2 Chronicles 32, 2 and 5. And on the bottom right is a transcription of the actual inscription itself. Pretty cool stuff. Another really key development in understanding the ancient world was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Let me give you a little context as to why this is important. Why was the Rosetta Stone important? Well, many people know the basics of it is that, yes, it helped us to unlock hieroglyphics. But one of the things that I learned a while back, which I thought was fascinating about hieroglyphics, of course, hieroglyphics is how the Egyptians wrote, and was like a bird and a hand and a feather and all this kind of thing. Why was hieroglyphics even lost to begin with? Well, it was lost because a Byzantine emperor, a Roman Byzantine/Byzantine emperor by the name of Theodosius I in 390 AD outlawed hieroglyphics and the learning and the reading. So the last remnant of Egyptian priests that could read hieroglyphics was all the way back in the 4th century AD. It was outlawed because of its pagan overtones, and because Theodosius was, quote unquote, a Christian emperor, and Egypt was under control of the Byzantine Empire, or at least I think it was at that time. He outlawed the reading of hieroglyphics. So it was lost in 390 AD by the Roman/Byzantine Emperor Theodosius I. So nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics. And so the reason why this is important is because there's all kinds of artifacts in Egypt, but we don't really know what they mean because we can't read hieroglyphics. So in 1799, the French dictator/emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, when he was battling the Turks in Egypt, one of his lieutenants found something called the Rosetta Stone. His name was Lieutenant Bouchard, and they were actually reinforcing an ancient fort near Rashid, Egypt, and he came across this big, huge stone there on the bottom left. This is what we think it may have looked like. The stone was actually procured by the British, that they actually got from the French because they blockaded I believe it was the port of Alexandria. Napoleon was back in France, and the British actually took the Rosetta Stone and they took it back to Britain. And it was there in the British Museum, which is where it is today. This is why it's in the British Museum. But nobody really knew what it was. They knew it had 3 languages on it. And the bottom language is Greek. The middle language is a language called Demotic, 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 not demonic. And the top language is hieroglyphics. And it wasn't until the 1820s until a young French scholar by the name of Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered the Rosetta Stone, which then helped us to unlock Egypt. And this is an actual cool little picture here of actually how he did it. Now, he wasn't the only guy that was working on trying to decipher the Rosetta Stone. There was another scholar in England by the name of Thomas Young, who was also working on this. And Young did discover that these little devices that, and the other French scholars, these little devices in the hieroglyphics, now called a cartouche, which is a French word for cartridge. It sort of resembled a little paper cartridge that French soldiers would put in their muskets when they would want to fire the old musket gun. But in the cartouche was a little semicircular little thing that actually had writing in it. They discovered that these cartouches contained the names of royalty, Egyptian royalty. And from there, they worked on deciphering the Rosetta Stone, and they discovered the name of Ptolemy, Alexander, Cleopatra, and Bernice. So pretty cool. And then they also Tutmosis as well. So that's sort of the key to unlocking the hieroglyphics, which I think is pretty cool. Another thing that was discovered in the 19th century, I mentioned earlier the fact that there was some excavations done in Iraq by the Germans, in particular in Nineveh, and in the Royal Archive in Nineveh by Ashurbanipal, who was a Neo-Assyrian king. It contained this really amazing archive of clay tablets Tablet 11, which is known as the Deluge Tablet or the Flood Tablet, but it actually is not. They initially thought it was the flood. It was actually a British scholar named George Smith working in the basement of the British Museum, who actually he was the first one to actually decipher this text. This is known as cuneiform or cuneiform. I've heard it say it's pronounced different ways, but this is what it looks like. It's essentially wedge-shaped writing that predates actually hieroglyphics. So this is some of the oldest language in the world. The key, now many people know about the Rosetta Stone. Many Christians even are familiar with the Rosetta Stone, but many folks are not familiar with another very key inscription that helped us to unlock the ancient world. And so this one would be something called the Histone inscription of Darius the Great. This is actually carved in on a mountainside wall, a rock wall, and it's a trilingual inscription. And it was from Darius the Great, essentially like a giant billboard. And the guy to help unlock that was a guy by the name of Henry Creswick Rawlinson. Essentially, it's written in Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. And it also gives a biblical reference to the Persian victory over Babylon and the rise of Darius I. So even this inscription itself is an affirmation of some of the events in the Old Testament, but then it also helps the scholars to unlock how to read these cuneiform inscriptions. So very, very important. Another very important figure in early biblical archaeology, and this is where we're going to sort of transition, and this is a very important figure. In fact, I would call him the father of biblical archaeology. He's a British scholar. First, he was an Egyptologist, and then he began to work in Israel. And his name is William Matthew Flinders Petrie. He was the guy who discovered the Merneptah stele in 1896, which mentions Israel by name, one of the first inscriptions to mention Israel by name. But he was the first guy to introduce rigorous scientific excavation methods in biblical archaeology. He also pioneered ceramic typology or pottery for dating archaeological strata. Very important. He learned this actually from the Germans. He was actually friends with another very famous archaeologist, not a biblical archaeologist, but another famous archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. And Schliemann actually excavated what he believed was ancient Troy from the Trojan War, from the book The Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer. And Petrie went to visit Schliemann in Troy, and Schliemann's one of his chief scholars, and really this guy was probably more astute than even Schliemann, was a guy by the name of Frank Calvert. And so from Frank Calvert and Heinrich Schliemann, Flinders Petrie learned how to do sequential scientific excavation of the actual different layers of a site that we call a tell, which we'll talk about here in a second. So this guy is very important. So if you are in a class now and you want to know, well, who is the father of biblical archaeology, I would say it was Matthew Flinders Petrie. And by the way, there is a Petrie Museum and Institute there in London, England. If you ever go to London, that I would encourage you to check that out. I have not been to London yet, so I know I've got a couple of friends who have lived there now, maybe visited there, who tell me about it all the time, and don't get me started on that. I got to go to the British Museum too, but very important guy in biblical archaeology. Okay, so I mentioned a tell, and what in the world is a tell? Well, a tell is an artificial mound of layers built over an or that have accumulated over an archaeological site. And you would typically think that when an archaeologist goes to dig at a site that they just take off, it's very straight and level, and it's not, because various reasons. Tells are a big jumbled mess. The best way I can describe doing excavation at a tell is imagine not one, but imagine four jigsaw puzzles with 4 different pictures, and you get the pieces of the puzzle and you jumble them together in a big mess. It's not quite that bad, but it's pretty close. and you have to take the pieces out carefully, and you have to then group them together. Okay, we know this color, is maybe you have a puzzle of a church or a mountain scene, and you can sort of group the pieces together that matches that puzzle. That's sort of the way it is for a tell. Now, there have been a lot of advancements in actually how to excavate a tell. And this is what makes archaeology different than treasure hunting, where in early, what we call the antiquarian period in archaeology, people would just go, like in Egypt, they would just go try to find treasure to sell it on the black market. Whereas an archaeologist, we want to actually go and sequentially take off a layer by layer, and there are different methods for that as well. So stratigraphy is the description of the layers. That's what we get at. The thing that Petrie pioneered is the use of pottery over time to excavate in a tell. So the basic idea here in pottery typology, also called ceramic typology, is that pottery styles change over time. So just like a Coke bottle will change over time, like the first Coke was like invented in the 1890s, I think it was, and it was in this like kind of round glass bottle. And then as we move forward, now Cokes are in like plastic bottles, but you can see the sequence of changes over time. Well, in the same way, pottery styles change over time, and a careful analysis of the pottery will then help archaeologists to date the different layers of the tell. And so this is a very, very important science in archaeology. Pottery typology, also called ceramic typology. Here is a picture of Tel Megiddo. There in northern Israel. It's being excavated today, not now, but I think by a team I think there's an American team, and they have joined, I think, some Israeli team. I think Dr. Eric Klein from George Washington University is part of that team now. But you can see there, I want you to notice there in the sort of right in the bottom part of that tell, in the bottom circle part of that tell, there's a giant like trench. That is how early archaeologists thought the best way to excavate, and we know that is the worst way to excavate. The trenches were very destructive, and they're not the best way to do the tell. Now we use something called the Wheeler Kenyan Method. Kathleen Kenyon was a British archaeologist, and Mortimer Wheeler, who she learned from in England, really applied a more rigorous scientific approach to actually excavating at an actual site, a tell. And so that was a very important development in the history and the science of archaeology, is this method of excavating at the site. So that's what a tell looks like. And by the way, let me say this one last quick thing here before we move forward about tells and about how they form. You would typically think maybe that given a site in Israel or the Near East, that let's say an ancient city, that tells will just form automatically, and that's just not the case. Because just because you have a city doesn't mean it's going to form a tell. Tells usually form because of a particular type of building that happened in about the early to, well, actually Middle Bronze Age, known as fortification. So they would build walls around these cities, and then the dirt would get behind the walls, and then they begin to build over time. So the reason why they form tells is because of these Middle Bronze Age fortifications that were actually built into these sites. The other very key person that you need to know for biblical archaeology is really this guy here. He is the high watermark of biblical archaeology in America and in the world. And his name is William Foxwell Albright, 1891 and 1971. He is the founding father of American biblical archaeology. He was an archaeologist. He was a biblical scholar. He was a philologist. What is a philologist? Someone who is an expert in biblical languages. He could read. He was fluent in multiple languages. Not only that, but he was a ceramics expert. He could do everything. I mean, this guy was just an absolute genius when it came to the application of science and linguistics and scholarship to the biblical record. And so Albright is really considered to be what I call the high watermark in American biblical archaeology. He had a colleague, and I don't know if I'm related to this guy. I would love to think that I am, but I don't know that I am. I may not be. His name is George Ernest Wright. So it's called the Albright Wright synthesis, and I like that. So, but that's what it's called, and you can read that in the books as well. But Albright, along with G.E. Wright, brought biblical studies together with linguistics, historical geography, and archaeology into a grand synthesis. So, biblical archaeology, archaeology specifically aimed at understanding the biblical text, really was brought all together by William F. Albright. It wasn't just that you go dig in the ground. It was, how do we understand the text in its linguistic context? How do we understand it in its historical context, in its geographical context, and then also in its archaeological context? So it's really multidisciplinary. And that's one of the things I personally like about the Albright Wright synthesis, is that it is interdisciplinary, that it brings together a lot of things. Now, obviously, everyone can't be an expert in languages. Everybody can't be an expert in this or that. Albright was. Most biblical archaeologists, or most archaeologists working today, prefer to call themselves Near Eastern archaeologists, not biblical archaeologists, because they don't like that what it might connote that they are some kind of fundamentalist or whatever. But there was a time in which the term biblical archaeology was an accurate description of what scholars actually did. And so this was the Albright Wright synthesis was considered to be the high watermark in biblical archaeology. This is known as the golden age of biblical archaeology under the Albright Wright synthesis. Let's see, let me go back here and say a couple of quick words about this and where this really began to sort of go downhill. It was in the 1950s when Wright passed away. Obviously, he had many colleagues, he had many students, and some of the students then had students as well. And so they sort of carried on with the Albright Wright School of Biblical Archaeology. And some of them landed in very prestigious organizations like Johns Hopkins University, there in Maryland, I think it is, and then also at Harvard University. And I'm thinking of Frank Moore Cross at Harvard University. Cross was a student. I was a student of someone who studied under Frank Moore Cross, and that was Dr. Not Bill Deaver, Bill Deaver's friend though, Dr. Joe Sager, who studied at Harvard. And his colleague was Bill Deaver, who eventually went to the University of Arizona. So they are sort of carrying on this idea of the Albright Wright synthesis. But again, to break down, because of the influence of social sciences, the social sciences in biblical archaeology. And there began to be a call among American biblical archaeologists and scholars to get away from the term biblical archaeology. And they didn't like that term. And in fact, back in the, goodness, when was this? Back in the I'm trying to think, I'm going back to this, because I was actually a student of archaeology at the time. But it used to, there's a journal of ASOR. ASOR stands for the American Schools of Oil and Research, that was founded by William F. Albright and George Ernest Wright, by the way. They founded ASOR. And their specific purpose of ASOR was to study the biblical, historical, archaeological context of the Bible. And so they had a journal called The Biblical Archaeologist. And it was the very prestigious journal that was published. Very scholarly, very academically rigorous articles. Well, as a student of archaeology, I was an undergrad student. I got a student subscription to Biblical Archaeologist magazine journal, and one of the issues, they issued a big questionnaire in which they were going to take a survey among their subscribers, because they wanted to change the name from biblical archaeologists to Near Eastern archaeologists, which is what it is today. So as a student, I actually stated that no, they shouldn't change the name of the journal, because that was the name that Albright and Wright gave it back when they started it. And the focus is on the biblical record. And so they actually published my name in the next issue. So I'm in one of those issues somewhere. I think it was Theodore or Ted Wright or something like that in the Biblical Archaeologist magazine. It was overwhelming, though, the people who said that you shouldn't change the name from Biblical Archaeologist magazine to Near Eastern Archaeologists, but they changed it anyway. So the majority of the people who were subscribing to Biblical Archaeologist magazine said you shouldn't change the name, but they did it anyway. And so now people today that are working in the Near East, working in Palestine, specifically Israel and Jordan, the Transjordan, they don't call themselves biblical archaeologists. That today, that is a pejorative term. You need to know that as a Christian. Those of you who are Christian believers need to know that the term biblical archaeology is not looked upon as a good thing by professional archaeologists, because when they read that, they're thinking back that you are trying to necessarily prove the Bible, although that it can work that way, but we're going to hopefully bear that out here more in a minute. So what are some principles of biblical archaeology that I think are important that we need to talk about? And the first one is this. These are just me. This is just me personally, Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology. And that is this. Coming to looking at the Bible and archaeology, one of the things we got to deal with that I think is important is the nature of the biblical text, hermeneutics and inerrancy. How do we understand the text? Is the text giving us accurate historical information? Because every scholar comes to the Bible with their own preconceived ideas about what the text is, whether or not it's just made up or whatever. And everybody has their commitment. So no one is completely immune from having biases. The question is, are you able to articulate your biases and your rather presuppositions in a way that can be defended? And so these issues, the issues of the nature of the biblical text, these are not questions that archaeology can answer. These are questions that dive into theology, that dive into philosophy, that dive into philosophy of hermeneutics, the philosophy of language, and all those sorts of things. But let me just say here at the outset, or not at the outset, but let me say here at this point, rather, that my principles, as I look at the biblical text and as I look at the archaeological record, I have commitments as a evangelical Christian, conservative, that I believe the text is inerrant, and I believe the Bible is historically reliable. Now, why does that figure into archaeology? Because if I don't think it's historically reliable, then I'm going to accept what any scholar says. Well, we don't have any evidence that the conquest happened, or there's no evidence that the time is wrong. Well, then I'm just going to throw my hands up and go, well, you know what? I guess you're right. I guess there wasn't a conquest. There wasn't an exodus because the scholars say it wasn't. But as a Christian, as a biblical scholar, I'm like, no, wait a minute. There was, because, I mean, is the text just giving us made up myth, or is it giving us accurate historical information? Again, my commitments are as a conservative evangelical that I believe the text is inerrant, and I believe it's giving us accurate historical information. So I just state that here from the get-go. That's where my presuppositions lie. The other thing that's important in principle in biblical archaeology is historical geography. Where did the events of the Bible take place? The Bible talks about all kinds of, you can go to every single place. The Bible is not just making things up. You can go to every single place the Bible mentions. You can actually go there. You can actually visit Rome. You can visit Jerusalem. You can visit Capernaum. You can visit Tiberias. You can visit Jericho. You can visit any places that is mentioned in the Bible. You can actually go and visit. So that's very important. And just that alone, I think, argues very strongly for the historical reliability of the text. Not even the archaeology, just the geography itself argues for the reliability of the text. Now, there are some sort of problem areas, not problem areas, but some areas that evangelicals debate over as to the identification of certain sites. Is this site Sodom and Gomorrah, or is this site? There's actually two sites that evangelical scholars, archaeologists, debate over as to the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. You may not know that. We do believe there's evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah. There's archaeological evidence. The question is, which site is it? There's a northern site and there is a southern site. And so there's debate, and there's that's a good thing, I think. That's not a bad thing, but we all agree that it actually happened. So geography is very important. Then also the third principle, I think, important in biblical archaeology is scientific integrity and methodology. Biblical archaeology is not just some pseudoscience. It's not just some that we're trying to fulfill our own ideas about what we think happened. I think that most people that I know, most of my colleagues that are in the field, They are very scientific, very rational, very intentional on trying to understand what the site is actually telling them. And so they apply a very rigorous scientific methodology to actually excavating the site. So we want, as biblical archaeologists, I think it's important that we utilize the greatest advancements, the most up-to-date excavation techniques and methods to try to understand the ancient world and these ancient sites. So I think that's very important as well. And then the thing that really marks off biblical archaeology from any other archaeology, and this is really the crux of the matter here, and that's something that is called historical synchronisms. And that is a historical event mentioned in the Bible, and then we have an archaeological site or artifact that dovetails perfectly with what the biblical record says. So that's really the bread and butter of biblical archaeology, or what we call historical synchronisms. So in other words, they are hand in glove. The Bible says this, we found this. The Bible says this, we found that. That's called a historical synchronism. Another very key part of that is something called biblical chronology. And this is the superstructure on which we try to reconstruct biblical history and when did the event happen. And the Bible gives us all kinds of historical markers that we can go and investigate. Just off the top of my head here, think about Luke chapter 2, I think it's Luke chapter 2. Yeah, it's the birth of Christ. In the days of Caesar Augustus, when Quirinius was governing Syria, there was a Roman tax that went out. Right here, the Gospels are giving us historical markers that we can actually go and investigate. It's not like, in the days of King Arthur, whatever. It's giving us accurate historical information that we can actually go and investigate. And chronology is very important in doing that as well. And then finally, one of the other great benefits of biblical archaeology is what I call textual illumination and clarification. So at Epic Archaeology, if you've watched any of my videos, you'll know and understand that I have taught that archaeology can function in one of three ways, sometimes all three at the same time. Archaeology can affirm the historical basis of a text. And notice I didn't say prove the Bible, but definitely affirm the historical basis of the text. And number two, it can illuminate the text and it can clarify the text. So because we are separated from the biblical text by at least 2,000 years with the New Testament and at least 3,000 years and more with the Old Testament. So archaeology could then help us to understand what the original writers understood when they're making reference to a particular practice that they would do or whatever, like the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart. Well, we know that hardening of the heart is not a good thing. You're just being stubborn. But now that we know ancient Egypt, and now that we know that the hardening of the heart was actually not good in Egypt. In fact, there was a whole papyrus in Egypt dedicated, and a whole religion dedicated to stopping the heart from being hard of the Pharaoh. In fact, when the Pharaoh would be buried, a scarab would be placed over his heart to keep it soft. So when we read the account in the Exodus about Pharaoh hardening his heart, the archaeology gives us illumination into understanding that whoever wrote this text is giving us accurate historical information, and they're illuminating the text in a way that we could understand it before. Okay, so what is the relationship of archaeology and apologetics? Something I've talked about before. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it because we're going to talk about archaeology. But when it comes to the New Testament, the central claim of Christianity is that Christ claimed to divinity and also that he rose again bodily from the dead. That's the central claim of the New Testament. The primary source for that is the New Testament. That's where we get the information about Jesus rising from the dead. So archaeology can verify historical claims and references found in the New Testament, giving us good reasons to trust its message. So there are internal evidences in the text, and there are also external evidence in the text as well that argue for the reliability of the text of the Bible in the New Testament. And again, this is something you've heard me talk about before. You've probably seen videos on this, me talking about this, but primary sources are really what we're all after. and they're eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. And with the biblical record, it is a historical record, and the archaeology can affirm if these are actual historical eyewitness events. And it can actually tell us these things actually happen. Very important principle here. Again, the three functions of archaeology: clarify, illuminate, and affirm the text. Let me go through a few important discoveries that were made. Again, to reiterate something I said earlier in the talk tonight, and that is that many discoveries that were made that affirm the text were made by people not setting out. These are not made by quote unquote biblical archaeologists. These are made by people that are just digging, Israelite or Jewish archaeologists, Israeli archaeologists working in Palestine, and they discover these evidences. There actually is an inscription that was found in 1993, 1994 in northern Israel. It's in Aramaic. It's a black basalt inscription. It actually contains the name of David. And it is the first extra biblical mention of the Davidic line. The Misha Stele could also contain a second Davidic, and I actually think the Misha Stele was actually first. It's debated today among scholars, but I think it's actually legit. It also mentions some other biblical figures such as Joram, Ahab, Ahaz, and Hadad that are also mentioned in 1 Kings 15 and 1 Kings chapter 8. Also, fairly recently, Hezekiah's bulla, which is a clay seal, was discovered there in Jerusalem. And then also Ahab's ring. This is the bronze ring from Ahab, the king in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Pretty cool. Jezebel was, her seal was discovered as well. While excavating in Samaria, the OI here in Chicago unearthed building structures and temples built to Asherah and Baal. And we know from the Old Testament that, well, who was Jezebel? She was a Canaanite, and she worshiped Baal and Asherah. We see the confrontation of the Baal and Asherah prophets with, who was it? Hey, my brain is shot here. What's his name? It's not Ezekiel. My brain is shot. I'm thinking of something else. It'll come to me in a second. The location of the seal was definitely, the context of the seal definitely tells us that it was definitely Jezebel. It's consistent with 1 Kings 21, which tells us that Jezebel was accustomed to sealing documents for her husband. 1 Kings 21:25. So we actually have her seal as well. Jericho was discovered, excavated, still being excavated. It was discovered that the walls actually fell out from the city, not in. If you'll notice there in Joshua 6, the last part of verse 5 tells us that the wall of the city will collapse outward and the army will go straight up, straight into the city. Back in the 1930s, Jericho was excavated by John Garstang and the University of Chicago. And then before that, it was excavated by the Germans, and they discovered this double-walled city. And then in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon came along and excavated as well. And what they discovered was a late Bronze Age wall that had collapsed exactly as the biblical record says. Now, this is a point of contention today among many scholars today, many secular scholars who deny Garstang's interpretation of Jericho. I think Garstang was correct, and we can perhaps get into that later. But this is actually the cross-section of Kathleen Kenyon's trench 1. And you can see there on the left, that little triangular little segment there. This is the fallen bricks that basically formed a ramp. Now, when you have an earthquake, the wall will typically fall, maybe it's going to fall outwards, maybe it's going to fall inward, or not an earthquake, rather, excuse me. If you have an army and they're breaching the wall would actually fall inside the city. But in this case, the wall fell out, which indicate there was probably earthquake. The reason why it's debated today because of pottery, again, this is an important component of biblical archaeology, and there's been a lot of great work done by Dr. Bryant Wood from ABR on this with the late Bronze Age pottery. One of the points of contention about the interpretation of Jericho today is the fact that the radiocarbon dates don't match with what the biblical dates actually say. But we know that there is some problems in the late Bronze Age with radiocarbon dating, and the same problems are found in Egypt. So we can't trust the radiocarbon dates to give us accurate historical information. In other sites, when we find in the late Bronze Age, when we find Cypriot bichrome pottery, we always date that site to the late Bronze Age, which supports Garstang's original interpretation of Jericho. The point being that we have archaeological evidence that Jericho was destroyed exactly as the Bible says it was. And I'm going to finish up with this and then open up for Q&A. This is Lachish that, again, to make mention here, we have a reference, a historical reference that you can actually go and investigate in 2 Kings 18. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah sent the word to the king of Assyria at Lachish. Now, why did Hezekiah send word to the king about the king of Assyria at Lachish? Because Lachish guarded the main road leading up to Jerusalem, which is located about 30 miles northeast. So in 1929, the site of Lachish was identified by William F. Albright as the ruins of Lachish. In 1932, large-scale excavations were conducted by the British. And so all the archaeological data so far support this thesis. This is an actual photograph of what it looks like today. You can see there the the outer gatehouse, and then the ramp to the outer gatehouse. And so again, just to re-emphasize what I'm trying to say earlier, and that is that the biblical record mentions places that you can actually go to. That is greatly significant. It's not just making cities up. It's not like saying, like in the two towers, at what was it? At Helm's Deep, in the Tolkien novel Lord of the Rings. This is not some made up novel. This is the biblical record is giving us accurate names of real places that were excavated, that are continuing to be excavated. And not only that, but this is kind of what it would have looked like back as a reconstruction. But it also, the archaeology from Assyria affirms this as well, that this account in 1 Kings about the Assyrian king Sennacherib laying siege to Lachish is actually recorded in something called the Annals of Sennacherib, which is we know of 3 of them. There may be more, that we think there were multiple copies, but one is located here in Chicago at the Oriental Institute. This recounts Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem, in which he basically says that he destroyed all the fortified cities of Judah and he took them. That's essentially what it says. And then it says, as for Hezekiah, and I'm paraphrasing here, as for Hezekiah, that Jew, did I not have him caged up like a bird in Jerusalem? He never says he took Jerusalem. It just merely says that he had him caged up like a bird, which also affirms what the biblical record says, that there was a besiegement of all the cities, and the cities were destroyed. And we can go, in fact, I'm going to come back to Lachish here in a second and show you that Lachish was destroyed exactly as the Bible states and exactly as the archaeological record says. This is one called the Taylor Prism. It's in the British Museum, and it is the exact same thing that the OI prism says. And there's another one, I believe, in Jerusalem as well. Not only do we have the prisms, but we also have the same event commemorated on the palace walls of Lachish in Nineveh in Iraq. This is actually a photograph of what took place. And this is a picture here of what it would look like. It was 16 panels long. And you can see there on the left panel on that little tower, the defenders of Lachish are trying to shoot down bows and arrows. And they would pour hot oil on them. And the Assyrian army impaled. You can see there in the bottom of that picture there, that left panel there, you can see the bodies on the impalement stakes. And it was pretty brutal. In fact, I talked to one archaeologist who's actually, I've not been to that site yet to visit it, but I'm told that there are still Assyrian bronze arrowheads still embedded in the walls of Lachish. That's how violent this besiegement was. Again, I'm going through just some significant discoveries here. Really great discovery, 1990. Archaeologists discovered the Ossuary of Caiaphas. This is the high priest that presided over the trial of Christ. You say, well, Ted, how do you know it's the same Caiaphas? Well, I don't have time to get into all the details, but let me just say that Josephus tells us, Flavius Josephus, a first century Roman historian, tells us that Caiaphas, the same high priest that presided over the trial of Jesus, his name was Joseph ben Caiaphas. And that's exactly what this says on the sarcophagus, this ossuary, which is really a bone box, is really what it is. It contained the bones of Caiaphas, and the bones were actually still in the box. And through analysis, they actually discovered that the bones were of a 60-year-old man or older. And so we could actually, folks, have the bones of Caiaphas. That is significant. I mean, that is a big deal. That's a really, really big deal. I'm going to end with this one. This is Herodium, built by Herod the Great and named in honor of himself. And I'm going to end with this because I think this is really great. In fact, when I read about this several years ago, I thought this was pretty amazing. And I wondered why it didn't get a lot of traction among apologists and archaeologists, Christian archaeologists. And now I know why. Several months ago, I interviewed New Testament archaeologist, Near Eastern archaeologist rather, Jody Magnus, and she is a New Testament archaeologist. She's an archaeologist that works primarily in late Temple Judaism and early Islamic Israel. And I interviewed her for our Monocle and Spade podcast. And if you've not watched that, you can actually go to YouTube and click on the playlist for Monocle and Spade and Jody Magnus, professor of archaeology at UNC Chapel Hill. She wrote an article on this. And Jody basically says this. Now get this, in 1992, I think it was 92, and I'll get the slide next. I'll show you the slide. An archaeologist that had spent his entire life studying King Herod and his building and his architecture, Israeli archaeologist by the name of Ehud Netzer. Ehud Netzer discovered the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. And what Jody Magnus says about this, she says, this is the greatest archaeological discovery in Israel since the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think she's absolutely right. We not only do we have the bones of Caiaphas, we have the ossuary of King Herod the Great himself. And it's 2007, not 1990. So it's 2007. And there it is with Ehud Netzer kneeling down right beside it. Sadly, Dr. Netzer, in a kind of a weird, kind of strange thing, actually fell at Herodium and passed away several years ago. He was actually there, and I think his foot slipped. There's some really high parts of Herodium, and he actually died at Herodium, which is kind of odd. But in any case, he is a great scholar and a great archaeologist working at Israel. He discovered Herod's coffin. Well, the reason why this discovery was not made known, because when it broke in the media, there was a Discovery Channel special on the lost family tomb of Jesus, known as the Talpiot Tomb, that was put forth and touted by the Discovery Channel as finding the tomb of Jesus, the potential tomb of Jesus. And so it turned out to be a big fat nothing burger, and it was nothing. And Herod's coffin was discovered in that same year, and it didn't get any traction at all. But it is, according to Jody Magnus, this is the greatest archaeological discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the past few months, there have been some news stories coming out of Israel where archaeologists working at Nazareth found what could be the boyhood home of Jesus. So biblical archaeology is alive and well, and there are many discoveries that are left to be made. In fact, I would say this. I'm going to say this, that I think some of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the Bible are yet to be found. I'm just going to say that. And I think we're going to continue to see more and more confirmation. Again, not people setting out to prove the Bible necessarily, show, well, here's the Bible, but that just people, when you dig in Israel, you are going to find evidence that the biblical record is actually accurate, historically accurate. So with that, I know that's like drinking from a fire hydrant. So I will see if you guys have any questions. I know that's been a lot, like a whole lot of stuff to digest. So I'm going to, pardon me for a moment. I'm going to look at the live feed here if I can and see if you guys have any questions for this. And if you do, let me know in the comment section. If not, then I'm just going to ramble on and get a drink of water. So hang on one second, see if there are any questions. All right, I see 5 comments. Let me see here. Oop. All right, cool. Welcome everyone. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you, thank you. Greetings from the Philippines. Also from Cali, Colombia. Awesome, great to have you, Carolina. Charles Walker, good to see you, brother. And other people watching, thank you guys for watching tonight. Anybody have any questions? If you do, put them in the comment section and I'll try to get to them. No questions. You guys know, you guys are awesome. There's a lot more that we could talk about, a lot of discoveries. We could talk about the Exodus. We could talk about Abraham, historical Abraham. We could talk about the Davidic monarchy, the rise of the Canaanites and how the Canaanites figure in, discovery of the Canaanites, a lot of great stuff. What is the best, Charles Walker, Joe, what is the best archaeological evidence for the Jews being in Egypt? Great question, Charles. The best evidence, wow, that is an excellent question. And it's a loaded question. So let me just cut to the chase and tell you the best evidence is from a city in the Nile Delta called Avaris. The Arabic name for the city is called Tel El Daba. And the site was excavated, it's been excavated now for going on over 20 something years now, maybe 30 years, by an Austrian archaeologist by the name of Manfred B. Tack. And we believe that Tel El Daba is the location of the Israelites in Egypt. And this is indicative. The reason why we think they're Israelites is because we know from the archaeological record, from the artifacts and the things we found there, these are non-Egyptians. They're called Asiatics that came from the Levant, which is up in Israel, up in Palestine. And we also find the animal bones are kosher. Many of them are, in other words, they're of a particular diet. And then also the particular kinds of architectural dwelling places called the four-roomed house are found at the site at Tel El Daba. So that is one evidence. And then we see that house, that particular house design, we see it show up in Israel after we believe the Exodus happened in 1446 BC. So in the late Bronze Age, in 1446, we see this actual house type show up in Israel, in sites in Israel. So if these were Israelis or Jews living in Egypt, and then that house type disappears and then shows up back in Israel at the time of when the Israelites are beginning to infiltrate in the land, then this is evidence for the Israelites being in Egypt. The other one is really the smoking gun, and it's controversial. And I say controversial in quotation marks, but I believe it's legit, and I think it can be backed up with really good data. And this is something called the Proto-Sinaitic Inscriptions. These are inscriptions found on these things called stelae, and these are like they look like giant tombstones. And these are inscriptions that contain, get this now, the name of the Jews. Some of the names are just like Manasseh, and there's one Sinai inscription that actually contains the name of Moses himself. In fact, one of them is, I think it's Sinai 362 it's called, and I can pull up a slide here. I can show you later. Maybe I might post it in the comment section, the slide to show you this. But it says basically Hebrews from Bethel the Beloved. They basically, these inscriptions are found in a turquoise mine. We believe that the Israelites, when they were in Egypt, were mining turquoise for the Egyptians. And so as Joseph, of course, put his brothers in charge of this excavation of the turquoise, and every season when they would go there, they would make an inscription in the Sinai. And this Proto-Sinaitic language, this is actually put forth, and there's another video that you can watch with Doug Petrovich. He's wrote a book called The World's First Alphabet, in which he believes he has successfully deciphered these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions that actually contain the name of the Israelites in Egypt. So if he's right, this is the smoking gun, this is the Israelites. And interesting thing about the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions is that they stop inscribing these stones in 1446 BC, and they don't show up again. In fact, then we begin to see Proto-Hebrew show up in Israel at that time, which many scholars believe is derived from Ugaritic, but it's actually derived from a combination of Egyptian hieroglyphics and Paleo-Hebrew. So that's the evidence for that. What is the evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, this is from Vladimir Arienzo Jr. Okay, Vladimir, I think hopefully I'm saying your name right. There are two locations for the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. One is in the north. It's a site in Jordan called Tel El Hammam that's been excavated by Dr. Stephen Collins. And the other site is in the south part of the Dead Sea. It's a city, two cities called Bab Edra and Numeria. Both of these sites have evidence of a massive burning, massive conflagration and burning of these cities. So the question then becomes, it's not, do we have evidence of cities at the time of Abraham being burned, but the debate over the interpretation of the northern site versus the southern site is the dating of the destruction of these cities. The date that I hold to, or the cities that I hold to, are the cities in the south that are indicative of Sodom and Gomorrah, Bab Edra and Numeria. And these cities were literally built on a fault line, because in the Dead Sea is built on the Jordanian Rift Valley, and there was a lot of volcanic activity that took place in these valleys. And so any city that's built on these particular fault lines, they're going to be destroyed sometime or another. And so in the case with Tel Hammam, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly from reading some articles on this, I believe that Dr. Collins and others have found evidence that there was a meteorite that actually hit near this city, and that there was a meteorite that burned up the city. But the timing is different than the cities of Bab Edra and Numeria. So the reason why I hold to that is because I believe that there was a long sojourn, that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years, that that Jacob likely arrived in Egypt in around the year 1876 BC. So when you do the chronologies of the lifespans of the patriarchs, then that pushes Abraham's time back further into the 2166 BC timeframe of when Abraham would have been born. So the dating of the southern sites of Sodom and Gomorrah are more consistent with an earlier date of Abraham. But I know that there's debate among scholars for that. Great. Okay, so any evidence for crucifixion? I heard somebody found a bone. Yes, that is true. This is from a question from Mark Johnson. There was a bone fragment, a heel bone fragment that was found, and I don't know exactly when the date was, but it was actually found in an ossuary, or one of these bone boxes, of a crucifixion victim, and the name was actually on the bone box. I believe his name was Johanan, or John, and it actually affirms that there was Roman crucifixion in the 1st century. So this is, again, evidence of that crucifixion did happen in the 1st century, exactly as the biblical record says. So yes, there is evidence for crucifixion. I don't think anybody doubts that there was crucifixion. The Romans write about it. Josephus writes about it. It was a very cruel way for someone to die. And as a little side note, historically, crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. It was actually invented by ancient Carthage, by the Carthaginians. And the Romans actually perfected crucifixion. It was one of the most, if not the most painful way that a person could die. So yes, Mark, hopefully that answers your question. But yes, thank you guys for the questions, and hopefully this was helpful to you. And thank you guys for watching, and appreciate your support and your prayers. And please continue to share our videos and our stuff on social media. And we're going to be continuing to produce new videos and new content. So please be patient, stay tuned. Again, thank you for watching. Sorry for talking 100 miles an hour, but I get excited about this stuff. But if you do have any questions, I'll be around here in the next few minutes online. If you have questions, I'll try to answer them in the comments. And I am going to post the inscription of Moses and the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions for Charles. You asked about that, and others may be interested in that as well. But again, thank you guys for watching. God bless you, and hope you have a great night.